Hey everyone, I wanted to go through a couple of quick thoughts on how damage is done in Diablo 4 and how the Season 1 patch kind of affects how your overall damage is going to be changed, how you can change the affixes that you're looking for, what's important and what isn't, because it can be a little difficult and challenging to kind of understand really the implications of this patch for Season 1 in Diablo 4. So we made a whole video that went through kind of all the patch notes. I kind of broad brushed a lot of those things, and the more I thought about it, the more I thought it might be worthwhile to go a little bit more in depth as to how the different nerfs are going to affect gameplay in Season 1. Big picture, my general impression with the Season 1 patch is that Blizzard is really trying to slow down gameplay in Diablo 4, and they're doing that via a couple of different ways. One, they have literally slowed down time by nerfing cooldowns by about 30%. Two, they've significantly decreased the amount of damage that you can do, which means you're going to be killing enemies a lot slower in the game. Three, they've decreased the amount of damage reduction that everybody has. So the game is going to be significantly more challenging. It's going to take you longer to clear through enemies and continue to progress. And then finally, they also nerfed experience from 25% at 3 levels above you down to 15%. So in general, all that's going to add up to taking more time to clear the same amount of content that you have. And this patch, to me, kind of feels like a typical Activision patch. You'll know what I'm talking about if you've ever played Warzone or Call of Duty. The sort of mentality of the Activision changes to their games has always seemed to be that they are not very concerned with how much fun the players are having. They're more concerned with how long the players are in the game. The longer that they're playing their game, the more likely they are to go to the store to buy cosmetics, buy whatever it is that they're selling there, things like that. So that's generally the kind of vibe that I get with this patch, is that it is more focused on extending the play time that anybody who's left after this patch and is still playing Diablo in Season 1, either in the seasonal mechanics or in the Eternal Realm, will just be playing for longer. So with that said, we'll kind of jump into what I want to talk about here and kind of take a look at the different nerfs, and then I've got a spreadsheet kind of doled out here, and we'll go a little bit into how damage is dealt in Diablo 4, how all the numbers kind of add up in the background, and kind of get into why this is kind of a big deal and maybe how they could change this in the future. So first of all, some of the key takeaways from the patch notes that we're going to be talking about are the affixes have been significantly changed when it comes to offensive skills. Some things were buffed, but other things were nerfed, but there's kind of a key important part here. So critical strike damage has been reduced by 17%. Vulnerable damage was also reduced by a whopping 40%. Even more so, any affixes on swords for crit strike damage were reduced by 50%, and vulnerable damage on crossbows was reduced by 65%. Now, there were a lot of buffs as well. These were to different affixes, the ones that they say were less used. For example, physical damage, shadow damage, cold damage, all these ones here got a decent little buff there. There's a reason that a lot of these weren't used, and we'll kind of go into that for a little bit. But when I first noted all these different damage decreases and increases, I kind of thought, well, it's going to be kind of difficult to see how that affects the overall damage numbers of my character, because I haven't sat down, I haven't really done the math, so that's what we're going to do right now. Now, in Diablo 4, the way that damage is calculated for each character is going to be a little bit different depending on what class you're playing, but effectively there are several damage buckets, if you will, where any affix that goes into that damage bucket will be added up to the other affixes that are in the same bucket. Then the separate buckets where all those affixes get added up into in each of those individual buckets will be multiplied together. All that ends up getting multiplied by your base damage, your hit that you do. That, of course, is going to be affected by your critical strike chance, the damage, or the attack speed, rather, that you do. So let's go for the rogue in this case, which is what I main. One of those damage buckets is going to be your main stat, so dexterity. That got nerfed as well, pretty significantly, depending on what it is on. For example, weapons. So we're going to see a lot lower numbers there. But that's a damage bucket. Another one is going to be your percent damage increase. Attack speed doesn't actually affect your end numbers per hit, but of course doing more attacks is going to get you more hits. And then you've got critical strike, the damage bucket for critical strike. Of course, critical strike chance is factored into that, so you have to have a high enough crit strike chance to be able to proc a crit. Once that crit is procced, now you've got critical strike damage, crit strike damage versus CC, vulnerable with cold, etc., etc. These are all in one damage bucket. Then we've got this really big damage bucket here that we're calling the additive damage bucket. And that goes into all these different affixes that you can find on all your gear. A lot of the times these are not very highly sought after. The reason for that is because they are all in one giant additive bucket, and they're all very niche in nature. So they're very specific things that have to happen before that damage can actually be applied. So for example, damage versus frozen. The enemy has to be frozen first for this damage to be able to take effect, to be added to the rest of the stuff that's in there, and affect your overall damage. If those criteria are not met, then they're not really doing anything for you. And then finally, here by itself in its lone damage bucket is vulnerable damage. So we're going to take a look at the critical strike damage bucket, the additive damage bucket, and the vulnerable damage bucket, because those are the ones that really affect the affixes that you see on all of your different gear the most, specifically on your weapons and your jewelry. So what we've done here on our little spreadsheet to kind of math this out is we have the pre-season 1 patch kind of damage construct. So we've got the critical strike or the critical damage bucket, we've got the additive damage bucket, and we've got the vulnerable damage bucket. Now, none of these numbers are going to be real. This is all just for the kind of sake of a thought experiment. So bear with me. These are all just made up numbers to kind of compare the pre-season 1 patch and the post-season 1 patch. All right, so for our example, we're going to assume that you have a 100% crit strike chance and you have a 100% vulnerable strike chance. Whatever enemy you're fighting is always vulnerable. We're also going to assume that any affixes you have on your gear, in this case, add up to 100% for each of these damage buckets. And that's just a 100% chance, or 100% damage increase, right? So we're making it super easy numbers. Just going to go 100%. So for example, let's say I have one ring. That ring has an affix that gives 100% critical strike damage. It also has another affix or multiple other affixes that come from this additive damage bucket here that gives you 100% damage increase. And then it's also got a line of 100% vulnerable damage increase. So when I say additive damage, we're going to take a look at what specifically is changed here. But for example, damage with dual wielding is one of those additive damage affixes that you can find on some of your gear. Now, some of these affixes may not actually be allowable on rings, etc. But again, this is just as a kind of thought experiment. All right, so we've done that with 2 rings, 2 swords, and 2 crossbows here as well. So you can see that if we assume a base hit damage of 1,000 damage, pretty easy number, and then we look at how each of these are going to be applied to that single hit, that one hit of 1,000 damage, we can see that we end up with This being multiplied by your critical strike damage bucket, which totals up, all these add up to 500, times the additive damage bucket, which they all add up here, times the vulnerable damage bucket. So these are all multiplied together to give you this, 125,000 damage for one hit, as an example. All right, cool. So what changed? So after the Season 1 patch has gone out, we played around with this today quite a bit. There were a few changes. So let's go ahead and take all these numbers and we'll adjust them. And we'll see what our damage is like now that the patch is out. So let's say critical strike damage on swords was reduced by 50%, right? So let's say that these are swords. And that these now are down 50%. So we're just going to take the total critical strike damage and we'll reduce that by 50% for both of our swords. Okay. Vulnerable damage on crossbows was reduced by 65%. So we've got our crossbow here. It's giving us vulnerable damage. And we're going to say that that's now 65% less for all the affixes that we had kind of totaled up on that one crossbow. So that's going to leave us with 35% left. Okay. So we're also going to assume that on each of these items, there is another stat line that gives you 100% of whatever the other damage bucket is. So we'll say that the crossbow still has a line of critical damage there, but that specifically has not been reduced yet because this is the one that we're looking at right here. All right. If we go up a little bit, we can see our crit strike damage just in general on all of these affixes reduced by 17%. So let's say on our ring, we've got that 17% reduction. So we're now going from 100 down to 83%. On the other ring, we're down to 83% as well. The swords already got that 50% reduction. The crossbow now goes to 83% as well. Okay, cool. Let's take vulnerable damage now. Down by 40% for everything across the board. So all of these go from 100 down to 60. So now what we see is, well, all this is starting to kind of take its toll here. So that deals with vulnerable and critical damage, nerfs that occurred in the Season 1 patch. And already you can see that we're doing significantly less damage. But it's even more so than you think because these are all multiplicative. So for our base hit of 1,000, just like we had before, instead of doing 125,000 for that one hit with all of these affixes we have, we're now doing only 47,000. So that is 38% of what we were doing in Season 1. Well, let's take a look at some of the buffs we have here. So all of these affixes here that got buffed, they are all additive affixes. All of these ones go into the additive damage bucket. None of them were crit strike or crit damage, and none of them were vulnerable damage. They all end up in this one bucket here. So even though they're getting a pretty big looking buff, like 25 to 33% increase in the amount that they can do, because they're going into an additive damage bucket, those are not being multiplied by each other. They're just being added to each other. When you're working with percentages, ends up being significantly less. So let's assume that all of these additive damages we're using are damage with dual wielding weapons. So that got buffed by 25%. These are now all 125. So we're going to see our damage go up again a little bit here. But you can see, even though we just changed 5 different items up to, by 25% for all of them, we only went from 38% damage that we were doing compared to Season 1 to 47%. So instead of doing 125,000 damage within that one hit, we're now only doing 59,000, almost 60,000 damage. So that's a pretty big difference there. So what does that kind of overall mean for your build? Well, unfortunately, I think it still means that having critical damage or vulnerable damage is still going to be very important for your build. You can see we're at 60,000 here. If we were to increase one of these up by, let's call it 50%, so we change this to 85%, we have a massive jump of 10,000 damage there. That goes up to 56% of what we were doing compared to 47%. So a 10% increase in damage. Now, getting an additional 50% vulnerable damage there is, of course, going to be rather difficult. But you're still going to want to have some vulnerable damage and critical damage there as well. Like, those two buckets are very, very important. What that's going to mean is that for your builds, we want to prioritize finding items that give us critical damage, vulnerable damage, and then after that, we'll take the additive damage if we can, ideally prioritizing ones that got this buff during this patch. That's going to help us a little bit there, but you can see that overall, we still need vulnerable, we still need crit. So I am not a fan of the way that Diablo 4 has vulnerable damage mech'd. I 100% agree. I think it is way, way too powerful. But the reason it's too powerful is because it's in its own damage bucket. I think a great way for Blizzard to have made all of these unused affixes much more appealing, much better for people's builds, much more enticing, would be to take some of these additive damage affixes and move them into a different bucket. So instead of having everything add up together, you now start to spread those affixes out. So some of those can go into the crit damage bucket. You can put those into the vulnerable damage bucket. And now when I find one of these situational affixes, for example, maybe something that does damage to, you know, shadow damage or poison damage or frost skill damage. Like maybe I've got a Sork that's doing frost build, right? Like, man, I'm going to use frost skills around all of my different, you know, enemies and the different skill sets. I'm kind of be frost oriented. Well, you get a really good incentive to find affixes that do frost skill damage, because if they're in the vulnerable damage bucket or in whatever this other damage bucket is here, those then get multiplied by the other ones and they make them that much more powerful. So you'll want to use them more. Overall, your damage won't really go down. It might bump up a little bit because you now have to select, do I want vulnerable or do I want frost skill damage? Instead of being sort of forced into these specific affixes that require very specific conditions to proc, and they also just add up together. So I'm glad that vulnerable damage got nerfed. I think, however, because it's in its own damage bucket, it's still really going to be required in a lot of builds to kind of boost that damage up there, because any small amount of vulnerable damage you get is going to really give you way more than any of the other damage buckets that you have there. The other problem we have is because there are so many different affixes in Diablo 4, it really makes it very, very challenging to find the ones that apply to your build and that you want to use. Which I think is why crit damage and vulnerable damage were also so appealing, is because they apply all the time. These additive affixes that are situational are going to result in your build having a lot of variance in the damage that it does. It's going to feel very unsmooth. One of the reasons I loved playing on Rogue is that if you had a good amount of crit strike chance, crit damage, and vulnerable damage, you could proc vulnerable on a regular basis. The damage felt very consistent. You were doing kind of generally the same amount of damage the entire time that you were playing. Whereas now what I think the vibe is going to be is that you're going to have these kind of spikes in damage that go way up when some of these now start to apply and are getting added to your damage. And then you're going to have like these big troughs where the damage suddenly goes away because you're not fighting frozen enemies or poisoned enemies at that time anymore. So it's going to make the game certainly feel very different. But with that all said, please let me know if you have any questions or anything to add to. Of course, this was a very broad brush and was just meant to be sort of a thought experiment as we kind of go into Season 1 for Diablo 4. Please like and subscribe to the video too. Do all that YouTube stuff, you know, leave comments down below. Share this video with friends, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, we'll kind of see how Season 1 feels. Hopefully it's a lot of fun. We're doing a hardcore rogue let's play of Season 1, so feel free to tune in on that and see how we do. On our first gameplay session, we found the Butcher already, which was very exciting. So with that, everyone have a good night, and we'll see ya.